What does the post-tariff world look like? Lots of conversation the world over around how this impacts the United States, India, and economic growth in other countries. To talk about what to expect from here on, we're joined live and exclusive on the NewsTrack by one of the world's sharpest economic affairs commentators, Martin Wolf from the Financial Times. His articles and thoughts are very closely tracked world over, so we're very delighted at a time of so much uncertainty, Mr. Wolf, that you could take out time and join us in India today. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, of course.
So you've written in one of your columns that Trump's tariff formula is utter lunacy. Do you want to start by explaining why you think Trump has got his tariff script all wrong?
Well, I think you have to separate the objectives from the calculations, and both are pretty crazy. Trump believes that in the right world, a decent world, bilateral trade would balance with every country in the world. This is like saying, it's a strange metaphor, but it's like saying that my trade with my barber should balance. Obviously it doesn't. I spend money with some people and I earn money from other people, far fewer of course, and as long as my income and my expenditures balance, I'm fine. So the same applies to countries. There's absolutely no reason to worry about bilateral trade. The US has an overall deficit, that's an issue, but you never try to balance with every country. Now, having decided that's the objective, they have decided on a formula which essentially increases the tariff with the size of the bilateral deficit. So essentially, it's the ratio of the bilateral deficit of the US with its total imports from a country. So the bigger the deficit relative to the total imports from the country, the higher the tariff. And that also makes absolutely no sense, because you might have a big bilateral deficit with a country simply because it makes something you don't produce and you want. So you have a big bilateral deficit. Now they're going to impose a massive tariff on the import, or they were proposing, they now stopped, to impose a massive tariff on the import of something that they actually want. And it led to some really crazy results. Just about the highest tariff was going to be imposed on Lesotho. And if you think about it, I mean, it's obvious, it cannot possibly make sense for the gigantic United States to be worried about a bilateral deficit with Lesotho.
Okay, let's take this one by one. What does a post-Trump tariff world look like according to you? Right now, there is some fluidity around the tariffs he imposes, pauses, takes back, does multiple somersaults. But once all this tariff dust settles, what does the new economic order look like?
Well, the honest answer is I think we still don't know. I think there's one thing we do know now, or at least nothing is forever, and this is so unstable and fluid, it's difficult to be sure, but it looks as though tariffs between the US and China will remain prohibitive. They're at a level 145% at one level, 125% on the other. These are close to prohibitive tariffs. It's going to make many goods going on both sides unprofitable to trade. So that looks a major shock to the system. What it's going to look like on trade with other countries is still unclear. We have 10% tariffs all round. I suspect they're not going to be lower than that. How much higher than that they're going to be on some countries, I think we genuinely don't know, because that's what's now being discussed. And of course, there are special tariffs on certain industries, particularly automobiles and steel, because he's very, very sensitive on those cases. And there are very complicated arrangements now with Canada and Mexico. USMCA is still, rates are still applied, so they're very, very low. We have this very special exemption, which is supposed to disappear soon, on electronics imports from China, which is exemption from the prohibitive tariffs, but they've already said repeatedly that that's going to disappear. So that's basically what we know, and the rest is just uncertain.
You know, research reports put out over the weekend seem to suggest that the probability of recession is now close to 50-60%. Some CEOs were quoted as saying they think we're already in the middle of a recession. Mr. Wolf, what's your sense? As far as America is concerned, is America already in recession, slipping towards recession, likely to slip into recession?
Well, there are two problems with that. The first is that there is no scientific way of defining a recession. People want to know whether we're in a recession, but there's huge disagreement on what a recession actually means. There's a popular expression, that is to say, a negative growth in 1 quarter or 2 quarters, more normally one. But that's just a popular one. There is no standard definition. So we don't even know whether we're in a recession when we're in one until somebody, basically the National Bureau of Economic Research, has told us that the US has a recession. So that's the first big difficulty. And the second is this is very early in this process. It seems to me perfectly plausible a recession is on the way, but the impact of all this tariff mess on the economy is right at the beginning, and before we get the measurements that show that the economy is really slipping, will probably take months. So my guess is a recession is quite likely, but we definitely don't know yet.
What impact would an American recession have on global growth and the likely impact on India's growth?
Well, here we've got two economies affected. Obviously, a US recession is clearly going to slow the growth of other countries, depending on how open to trade they are. It depends then on how that affects US trading partners, big ones like Europe, Japan, so forth, and then how it affects India. India isn't very open to trade. It would clearly be affected. But given the growth of the Indian economy, there will be a slowdown, but nothing like a recession, I would assume. That would seem extraordinary, and policy can be respond to that. But the other question, of course, is what happens to China? If China's slowdown is quite significant after these tariffs, then that will affect the rest of the world too, particularly commodity exporters, for whom China is a huge market, and that will affect other countries, and we don't know how that's going to work. A very important element in this is a lot of Chinese exports come out via other countries. They're included in products exported from other countries, like, say, Vietnam. Now, at the moment, Vietnam has very low tariffs, about 10%. So presumably, Chinese transshipments, directly or indirectly, via Vietnam and similar countries, will continue. This would suggest that for this period, the effect on the Chinese economy might be muted to a significant degree, and therefore that wouldn't have a big effect on the world. But if the US follows up very quickly by tightening up on transshipment, the use of Vietnam and Chinese supply chain, Vietnam and Chinese supply chains to the world, then it could be more serious. And again, that's something we just don't know about. I argued a long time ago that rules of origin would inevitably come into play in this discriminatory world. All this discrimination we're talking about is illegal under the WTO, but rules of origin would come into play, and that would make it very complicated as the US starts, if you like, bashing a mole as it runs around underground, because Chinese exports are going to reappear in many different places.
What do you make of China's policy response to Trump's tariffs? Far from buckling down, Xi Jinping seems determined to fight on. Do you think he has the right, from China's point of view, the right pushback strategy? Who suffers more in the end, China or the United States?
Well, I don't know whether he's right or not, but I thought it was inevitable. China is a very major power. It's a very proud country. It feels very strongly that it was humiliated in the 19th century, and it's not going to be humiliated again. So to bow down to a bully like Trump, and clearly he is a bully, will be very humiliating for Mr. Xi, and I think more broadly for the Chinese elite. So I always thought they wouldn't do so. They would resist. They have clearly worked very hard over many years to Trump-proof, if you like, their economy. And I think they will be in reasonable shape to do so. The trade impact will be significant, particularly if, in the long run, the Americans are able to attack indirect Chinese exports, as I discussed. Direct exports from China to the US are not that huge. They can clearly survive. If they attack all the indirect exports, it would be more significant. But China finally has huge policy room. It can expand demand if it wants to. Public sector debt, government debt is very, very modest. It can clearly borrow more and spend more. It can transfer money to households which need it. It has a weak economy anyway, and that would motivate them, I think, to do these sorts of things. So I think they have a pretty fair degree of maneuver, room for maneuver.
But that seems to be against Xi's economic instinct. While he's a communist, he doesn't seem to be a socialist, and this kind of public welfare, social sector spends, from what he's said and done so far, seem to be against his economic instinct.
Yes, that I think is right, but there's an even more important instinct for survival. And I've just been in China a couple of weeks ago, and they are the technocrats I spoke were very clear that they are thinking about serious stimulus policies, really serious. And Mr. Xi knows very well, given that there's a weak demand already, there's a risk of deflation. He will be told by people that if they allow this to tip them over into a serious deflationary problem, with all the debt problems that will create in the private sector, in the local authority sector, that will be very bad for him. So in the end, I expect the Chinese to be pragmatic. Usually they have been.
Donald Trump said famously, I mean, call it what you will, that there are 75 countries that are wanting to kiss his backside, wanting to do trade deals, and he's now given a 90-day pause. India and the United States have said that they hope to conclude a bilateral trade agreement by fall. Is that doable, given the differences of opinion being deeply entrenched, particularly on issues to do with agriculture?
Well, I suspect it's up to India to decide. I'm sure you can do a deal very, very quickly if you accept all America's demands. But at least judging by our experience, because the issue has arisen, agriculture is usually a central element. Agriculture is a very important interest in the United States. And I would have thought, but you would know much more, that for India, acceding to really something close to free trade in agricultural products with the US would be sort of politically out of the question. But I may misjudge that. If that is out of the question, then I would have thought, and also in some other sectors, probably easier services is another sector that will be important. There's not much to worry about with US manufacturers, but agriculture and services could be big issues. And I have no idea whether India is going to make serious concessions. Of course, I also don't know how demanding the US will be with India. There's no doubt Mr. Trump likes Mr. Modi, likes India, and India is a very important country. And if he sort of burns his bridges with China, he's in terrible relations with Europe. Well, he's even got problems with Japan and Korea now. So I would have thought it would be sort of mad for him not to get into terrible trouble with India too. But he's so unpredictable, I'm not sure.
Has Trump thought this through? Is there a grand strategy? I mean, we saw Bill Ackman say, well played, Mr. President. You know, you first unsheath your sword, make it seem as you're going to chop somebody's head off, then say, I give you a 90-day pause, and then the courtiers are clapping. Is this policy thought out, you think, deeply? Or is he just making a policy on the fly based on what his billionaire friends are telling him?
Obviously, I'm not inside Mr. Trump's head. I can only watch him. But I'm pretty clear that I've never seen a sign of very careful strategizing. He doesn't strike me as a brilliant player of three-dimensional chess. So my instinct has always been what you see is what you're getting. He put forward these very radical proposals. They led to market turmoil, and he backed down because it really frightened him. And now he's playing it again by ear. He's always playing it by ear. That's my sense. Could be wrong, because I'm not in his brain, but that's what I see.
There's a lot of talk about what who emerges stronger in the end, China or the United States? And there have been past examples going back centuries of two leading economic powers unleashing trade wars against each other. Given the relative current state of economic strength, if there's no back down on either side, and if this is a war till the end, who do you think emerges stronger, China or the US?
Well, I think it's very difficult to say. My guess is China. And I think it's because they are very, very determined. I think this could actually force them to reform in very effective ways. I don't think Trump will be able to stop everybody else trading with China. It's such a huge trading partner for so many other countries. And I think, crucially, that the US has made itself untrustworthy. I mean, the way the US has behaved in these last few months has burnt its relationships and undermined trust in really important partners, Canada and Mexico, obviously, but also Europe. Even Japan and Korea, long-standing allies, are very concerned, is the US trustworthy? And it's not just here about trade. What they've done with Ukraine has also made people feel, is it a US really a trustworthy ally? If it's not a trustworthy ally, and you're a country that already trades a lot with China, and China's next door with its huge and growing military, are you really going to go all out to side yourself with the US and break with China? It would seem very, very risky.
No, so do you think
they're not going to do that?
Do Trump's actions and China's response force countries in the Asia-Pacific region to pick a side? Or will more countries, you think, try and do this fine trapeze, balancing both China and the United States?
That's what I think will happen. Or that's what I think they will try. Now, Mr. Trump may say, if you don't have 100 tariffs like ours on China, we won't import from you. Well, for many countries, then I think they will stick with China. Just as reliable, right there, and for many, a bigger market. Now, it could break up, could make a crisis in ASEAN, for example. But I think simply choosing the US, which is far away and becoming very erratic, over the rising power of China, would for many countries just seem foolhardy. But of course, they will do everything they can to avoid making that choice.
Will China push countries to pick a side between DC and Beijing, or will China not force countries in the Asia-Pacific region to either be with them or against them?
That's a very good question. I think if the Chinese are sensible, they'll leave the Americans to try and force them, because sort of that will give the result. But if it appears that American pressure is starting to make important countries lean towards them, I would well imagine the Chinese will also put pressure on them. And if that happens, then you can imagine lots of countries, I can list Indonesia, so forth, in the most horrible situation, because they just won't want to be at war with either of them, of course. It's a terrible situation. But the Chinese will do, they're completely pragmatic, whatever they think they need to do to defend themselves. We can predict that. They will do it fairly cleverly and deliberately. And at this stage, I think all this is really unpredictable. We don't know how this game will play out. They've started a new game. It's a very big game. It will determine the shape of our world, I think. But I'm not at all clear who's going to win.
It's impossible to say for certain, but I want to know your thought. Is this the new normal, these tariffs and the effort that Trump is making after him possibly wins? Or is this just a phase in a very long economic arc?
Well, I think it's probably how it is so long as Trump or someone like Trump remains president. I mean, if Vance succeeds him, for example, I don't know whether he played this game in this way. Trump is sui generis. The way he's done this is sort of unique. Once Trump leaves the scene, and after all he's 78, he is going to leave the scene not that far in the future, I think relations with the US, between the US and China, are going to remain very, very difficult. It's clear that they have now defined each other as the major enemy. And that could last a century. I have no idea how long, but it could last for the indefinite future. But I suspect it wouldn't be played in quite this way. I mean, the tariff trade obsession that Trump has, his desire to have a bilateral balancing and balance trade, that's sort of uniquely him, and it might not last in that form. But the great rivalry is the fundamental structure of our world, it now seems to me.
For sharing the wealth of your insights in a very turbulent world, Martin Wolf, thank you for your time.
Great pleasure.
Thank you, sir.